At 2:17 a.m., while the Pacific coast slept behind closed blinds and silent televisions, a single alert tone cut through the darkness inside NORAD's command center. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of sound that usually meant a drifting satellite or a stray weather balloon had crossed an invisible line in the sky. But this time, the tone didn't stop. The radar officer on duty, someone whose name the public will never learn, leaned forward and watched a faint, heat-bright speck climb across the grid. No transponder, no ID, no predictable orbit. Just speed, rising, accelerating, and locked on a path that made his stomach tighten. He glanced at the clock. 20 minutes. That was all the United States had, if the numbers were real. Nobody outside that room knew, not the millions asleep in Los Angeles. Not the trucker crossing Nevada alone on the interstate. Not the young couple leaving a bar in Portland, laughing under dying streetlights. America was quiet, unprepared, unaware that one silent object over the Pacific had already triggered a classified chain reaction. The officer called for a second verification, then a third. Each system returned the same answer: unknown object, ballistic trajectory, increasing velocity. The air around the consoles felt heavier. One supervisor locked eyes with another, and without speaking they both understood what the next protocol required. A coded phrase was spoken into a secure line, the kind of sentence that disappears from transcripts and reappears only in training manuals with half the page blacked out. The words activated a system almost no American has ever heard of. A protocol whispered about only in defense circles. Operation Night Fog. Its purpose was simple and terrifying: determine if the incoming object was a nuclear strike, and if so, intercept it before impact, or prepare the nation for the unthinkable. While alarms stayed silent to avoid mass panic, a different machine woke up. A network of aerospace sensors, submarine relays, and orbital platforms designed to see what the human eye cannot. Deep beneath Colorado granite, servers began cross-matching data in microseconds. On the dark runways of 2 Air Force bases, pilots were shaken awake with no explanation. Fighters capable of reaching the stratosphere rolled out into cold air, engines pulsing like distant thunder. The United States had been here before, though almost nobody remembers. In 1961, over North Carolina, 2 thermonuclear bombs nearly detonated after a B-52 broke apart in midair. One of those bombs came within a breath, a single faulty switch, of turning the East Coast into radioactive wasteland. In 1983, a lone Soviet lieutenant named Stanislav Petrov ignored a false warning of incoming American missiles and saved the world by refusing to push a button. In 1995, a scientific rocket launched from Norway looked to Russian radars like a nuclear first strike, and President Yeltsin opened the Cheget, Russia's nuclear briefcase, believing the end had arrived. History has come close many times. Tonight, the arc of that faint Pacific speck felt far too familiar. Inside NORAD, someone whispered the words nobody wants to hear. If it's real, we will not have time. Because no matter what people assume, no matter what movies say, America cannot stop every nuclear weapon aimed at it. Some can be intercepted, most cannot. That is why the government developed an unspoken backup strategy, a protocol that does not appear in public FEMA brochures. A plan meant not for the population, but for continuity of government. If confirmation of a nuclear strike ever becomes certain, there is a 7 to 10 minute window in which a very small group of decision makers must be evacuated through routes that don't officially exist. They call it the black window. And if that window ever opens, the rest of the country will never know until it's too late. But none of this was visible to the millions of Americans who continued to sleep while the object advanced. The Pacific was quiet. The sky was clear. And yet, deep below the surface of that calm, engines screamed to life, encrypted calls flew across continents, and a nation balanced, again, on a knife edge of uncertainty, suspended between a false alarm and the beginning of a new world. And as the object moved closer, crossing the last invisible line before the point of no return, the officer who first saw it realized he was watching something that did not behave like any weather balloon, satellite, or aircraft he had ever encountered. It looked, to him, exactly like the beginning of a nuclear strike. The object kept moving, steady, silent, impossibly deliberate. By 2:19 a.m., every major missile defense node west of the Rockies had flagged it. 3 separate tracking systems, built in different decades and using unrelated software, all agreed. The trajectory matched the early phase of a ballistic delivery. Not perfect, not conclusive, but close enough that the room grew colder. A second officer refreshed the thermal readings. The signature was wrong. Too faint for a large rocket, too stable for debris, too hot for atmospheric junk. It moved with the eerie consistency of something built, launched, and guided by intention. One supervisor finally said what everyone else had been avoiding. If that thing carries a device, Los Angeles is the target window. No one answered. They didn't need to. Everyone in that room had seen the classified FEMA charts, the casualty projections that aren't shown on television. The ones calculating what happens in a major American city when a single nuclear warhead detonates at optimal altitude. Outside NORAD, far from the underground silence, the first planes of Operation Night Fog were already airborne. These weren't the sleek interceptors movies love to show, but black-winged reconnaissance craft. Quiet, sensor-heavy, designed to confirm what satellites couldn't. High above the Pacific, they slipped into the dark like ghosts, feeding the command center a stream of data that made no one feel better. Then came the worst detail yet. The object was adjusting, not wildly, not erratically, just enough to stay on a consistent arc toward U.S. airspace. Unguided debris doesn't correct. Balloons don't correct. A missile does. In situations like this, there is no red siren, no broadcast, no emergency jingle on phones. At this stage, the government's priority is not public safety. It is confirmation. Panic kills more people than preparation. At least that is the logic written into the cold language of classified doctrine. And so, while the object climbed, America remained asleep. At 2:22 a.m., a different protocol activated. Almost no civilians even know it exists. It is not DEFCON. It is older, quieter, and designed to operate beneath public awareness. A set of underground servers cross-reference every possible nuclear signature. Heat, ionization, fuel residue, spectral trace. If enough boxes are checked, the country shifts into emergency continuity mode. Only the top tier of officials receives an alert, each one delivered on hardened devices with no commercial equivalent. Those devices vibrated that night. Not loudly, not urgently, just enough to say, prepare. Inside a handful of secure homes around Washington, D.C., lights flicked on behind reinforced curtains. Men and women whose names the public might recognize stood in their kitchens, staring at encrypted screens before calling one another on secure lines. Some whispered to their spouses. Some didn't. One quietly woke his daughter and told her to dress warmly, just in case. He did not explain what the case was. Back underground, NORAD analysts ran yet another verification pass. Nothing changed. The object was still there, still warm, still climbing. Too high now for most jets to reach. Too late for a conventional intercept. And then someone spoke the 3 words that no American official ever wants to say aloud. Assume first strike. Inside the command center, a quiet shiver moved through the room. The phrase didn't mean a launch command. It meant something else, something even heavier. Assume the United States is the target and prepare for the worst-case scenario. For ordinary people, the worst case is unimaginable. For the technicians in this bunker, it is something they have studied down to the meter. They knew exactly what would happen if a nuclear device detonated over a city like Los Angeles at optimal altitude. The first second would erase everything. Not destroy, erase. Humans turned into shadows on walls, cars liquefied, streets glowing, glass vaporized before it even had time to shatter. The next few seconds would pulp concrete into dust and send it racing outward faster than sound, flattening neighborhoods miles from the center. In 10 minutes, fires would merge into a single roaring storm hotter than crematorium furnaces. In 1 hour, radiation would drift across half the state. In a day, hospitals across the country would overflow with people whose injuries could not be treated. In 2 days, supply networks would collapse, communications fail, chaos bloom. And the government would still be underground, behind blast doors that only open from the inside. These were not theories. These were charts, numbers, and maps that every person in that room had been trained on. And tonight, they watched the sky counting down toward one of those maps. At 2:25 a.m., just as the arc dipped toward the last border of U.S. airspace, the object did something no one expected. It slowed. Not much, just enough to register. Then a flicker, a drop in heat, and then without a signal, without decay, without a signature of breakup or impact, it simply vanished. It was gone. Radar blank, sky empty. Trajectory ended midair like a candle, snuffed out by an invisible hand. No explosion, no debris, no explanation. A technician leaned back in his chair, staring at the dead coordinates in disbelief. Someone muttered, "That's impossible." Another said, "We'll call it sensor noise." The supervisor exhaled for the first time in minutes and rubbed his forehead. The official report, cleared for public release months later, said the event was a false track, a glitch, a misreading. But the men and women in that bunker never fully believed it. Because nothing they saw that night looked like a glitch. And even now, years later, one of them still says the same quiet sentence whenever the story comes up. Things like that don't just disappear. Not unless something made them disappear. When the radar screens went blank and the object dissolved into nothing, the room did not cheer. There was no sigh of relief, no joking, no release of tension. It was as if everyone understood without saying it, that fear doesn't end when a threat disappears. It ends when an explanation arrives. And this time, there was none. If a missile had detonated midair, the sensors would have picked up the flash. If it had broken apart, debris would have scattered across radar signatures like dust on glass. If it had simply fallen, gravity would have carried the pieces into the ocean, leaving a splash of heat or movement. But the sky showed nothing. A clean, quiet, impossible nothing. The duty officers reviewed every second of telemetry, over and over, different monitors, different servers, different algorithms. The more they searched, the more the profile matched one thing, and one thing only, an object behaving exactly like a nuclear delivery system, until the moment it didn't exist anymore. NORAD went off high alert by 3:19 a.m. The president was informed at 3:23. The continuity of government teams stood down by 3:40. And by dawn, the entire event was reduced to a series of encrypted file names and a brief internal memo about instrument divergence. But the people in that bunker didn't go home and forget, because they knew perfectly well what would have happened if the object hadn't faded out of existence. They had rehearsed that exact scenario hundreds of times, a nuclear detonation inside the United States. And unlike the vanished object, a nuclear blast leaves no mysteries, only certainty. If the device had reached Los Angeles, just one warhead, not even the largest kind, the flash alone would have turned morning into something brighter than any sun. People miles away would have seen the world go white, then black, then red as their retinas burned. Those closest would never have seen anything at all. They would have vaporized instantly, outlines burned into concrete, like delicate shadows. The shockwave would have arrived seconds later, ripping glass, steel, bone, air. A wind faster than a hurricane and hotter than molten metal would have swept through the city, flipping buses like coins and stripping buildings to their frames. Every fire station within 20 miles would collapse before its crews reached the trucks. And this was just the beginning. A nuclear detonation doesn't stop at destruction. It begins a clock, a countdown of minutes and hours that no emergency service can outrun. Within 10 minutes, fires would merge into a single roaring inferno, an oxygen-devouring monster stretching across neighborhoods. Within an hour, fallout would begin to drift east. Carried by wind patterns nobody pays attention to until they matter. Within 6 hours, cities hundreds of miles away would see the first signs. Ash like dust on car roofs, static in the radio, power flickering. Within 12, hospitals across the West Coast would overflow. And yet, despite everything Americans assume about emergency response, the truth in classified FEMA documents is brutally simple. For the first 48 hours, there would be no rescuers. Radiation would be too high. Roads impassable, communications broken, survivors trapped inside a labyrinth of fire and debris. People always imagine sirens, firefighters, FEMA trucks. That's fiction. The reality is an abandoned city, a dead zone with no lights, no help, no coordination, no way out. In those early hours, the U.S. government's priority wouldn't be saving the population. It would be saving itself. Continuity of government, preservation of command structure, evacuation of crucial leaders to the underground facilities built for exactly this scenario. Mount Weather, Raven Rock, Cheyenne Mountain, places the public rarely hears about. Places with blast doors as thick as highways and tunnels big enough to hide a small city. Places fully powered, stocked with food, water, fuel, medicine, even hardened communications that can survive nuclear pulses. Those underground cities would activate automatically, and the people allowed inside would number in the thousands, not the millions. That is the truth behind the emergency plans. They are not built for everyone. They are built for continuity, for control, for the survival of a government, not a nation. And in the darkest corner of those documents lies an even harder truth. After a successful detonation, there is no scenario in which mortality stays below 7 figures. Even one bomb changes the country forever. This is what the analysts in that bunker understood as they stared at the empty sky. This is what their silence meant. This is why the disappearance of the object terrified them more than if it had stayed. Because a threat that arrives and vanishes without explanation is not a comforting mystery. It's a warning. One officer, years later, said it plainly. If that thing was real, it means someone tested our response time. If it wasn't, then something we don't understand has entered our airspace. And when asked which possibility scared him more, he didn't answer. He didn't need to. Both were terrible. Both were possible. And both meant the same thing. Next time, the sky might not go blank. Next time, the countdown might not stop at 0. The official inquiry into the incident began before sunrise, though inquiry is too strong a word for what actually happened. No committee convened. No hearings were scheduled. No transcripts were taken. The process was quieter, almost ghost-like. A handful of analysts in windowless rooms were told to reconstruct the event using whatever scraps of data hadn't already been archived into classified vaults. They compared radar logs, satellite readings, thermal patterns, atmospheric disturbances. They even cross-referenced seismic sensors to rule out the possibility of some unnoticed mid-air detonation. Every system returned the same answer. The object had been real, for at least 8 minutes. Then the trail ended abruptly, like a line cut with a razor. The report that followed was no longer than 20 pages. It leaned heavily on phrases like anomalous tracking, signal divergence, and data interruption. Words designed to disguise uncertainty. Words that prevent questions. Words that governments use when the truth is unclear or too clear. The people who wrote the report didn't believe it. Neither did the people who read it. But the bureaucracy accepted it. Because the alternative, acknowledging that something unidentified, high velocity, and potentially hostile, moved toward the U.S. coastline before disappearing, would have raised questions nobody was prepared to answer. And so the story quietly died, at least officially. Unofficially, the men and women who were in the bunker that night did not forget. They carried the memory home with them, into their kitchens, into their cars, into the uneasy silence between waking and sleeping. Some dreamed of the blank radar screen. Others dreamed of the arc that never finished. A few developed habits, checking the night sky, listening for tones in the hum of appliances, watching shadows on walls. But one question haunted all of them. If that object had completed its trajectory, if a nuclear device had actually struck, how long before the country recovered? And would it recover at all? Hollywood likes to imagine that the aftermath of a nuclear attack looks like chaos, looting, burning cities. Reality is quieter, slower, and far more devastating. If Los Angeles had been hit that night, the first 24 hours would have decided the fate of an entire region. But the next weeks would decide the fate of the United States. Tens of thousands dead instantly, hundreds of thousands wounded, millions fleeing inland, overwhelming rural towns and small city hospitals unequipped for mass trauma, highways clogged with cars that eventually ran out of fuel, grocery stores emptied in hours, water systems compromised by contamination, communications fractured into a patchwork of working and dead zones. Within a week, the West Coast economy would collapse. Within 2 weeks, supply chains across the entire country would seize. Within a month, the federal government would struggle to manage not only the humanitarian crisis, but also the geopolitical one, because an attack on U.S. soil, whether confirmed or not, would trigger global consequences. Allies would fear escalation. Adversaries would see opportunity. Stock markets would plunge. Border tensions would spike. Military posture worldwide would shift into high alert. The world built on American stability would shake. Hard. And yet none of that happened. Not because America was prepared. Not because defenses worked. Not because diplomacy held. But because something, no one knows what, removed the object from existence. Weeks after the incident, one NORAD analyst requested to review the original raw telemetry again. It had already been locked away, but he was given temporary access. He expected noise, corrupted data, some glitch he had overlooked in the panic of the moment. Instead, he found something that unsettled him even more. The tracking was perfect. Too perfect. A clean arc from the moment the system detected the object until the exact millisecond it disappeared. No drift, no distortion, no fragmentation, just an object behaving with purpose until it stopped behaving at all. He told a colleague he felt as if someone, or something, had erased it mid-flight, like deleting a word from a sentence. Not rewritten, not altered, deleted. His colleague told him to stop thinking that way. Not because it wasn't possible, but because if it was possible, the implications were worse than any nuclear threat. Because a nuclear weapon is human, predictable, modelable, understandable. Whatever happened that night was not. And that is why, years later, when asked off the record what truly frightened him about that shift, the analyst said quietly, "We know how to respond to a bomb. We do not know how to respond to something that can make a bomb disappear." He paused, then added something even more disturbing. That night someone tested us, either our enemies or something else entirely. And in his eyes, it wasn't clear which possibility he feared more. The weeks that followed were eerily calm. Not publicly. Public life continued as if nothing had occurred. But inside certain agencies, the disappearance over the Pacific shifted, thinking in ways no memo ever admitted. Exercises were rewritten, timers shortened, thresholds lowered. Classified briefings started, including a new phrase: non-traditional aerial anomalies. Most Americans will never hear that term. It's a bureaucratic invention designed to plug the hole left when an object moves like a missile, but vanishes like a magician's trick. It's an admission wrapped in denial, a way of saying, we don't know what this is, but we cannot call it what it resembles. Still, even with that uncertainty, analysts returned again and again to the same terrifying question. What if the object hadn't vanished? Every model, every simulation, every emergency protocol pointed to the same conclusion. There is no scenario, none, where a nuclear detonation in a major U.S. city doesn't become the defining catastrophe of the century. The first hours would be pure annihilation. The first days, starvation and panic. The first weeks, the collapse of an entire region. But the first months, those would rewrite the future of the nation. Radiation zones would carve permanent scars across California. Millions would be displaced, resettled into hastily built camps throughout the Midwest. The economy would spiral, not gradually but instantly, as the world watched the United States, pillar of global stability, stagger under the weight of unimaginable loss. Insurance markets would fall first, then global markets, then supply networks, then confidence. The political landscape would fracture, emergency powers would expand, conspiracy theories would explode. And foreign governments, friend and foe, would reassess their entire strategic posture. This was the part of the plan nobody ever talked about outside sealed rooms. One successful nuclear strike doesn't just destroy a city, it destabilizes the world. Continuity of government facilities like Mount Weather, Raven Rock, and Cheyenne Mountain were designed for this chaos. Deep underground, beneath rock, carved by decades of fear, thousands of personnel could survive for months with food, water, generators, medical equipment, and communications that no electromagnetic pulse could silence. It is a hidden America, quiet, cold, clinical. An America meant to outlive the one everyone else occupies. In the event of a nuclear strike, these facilities would activate immediately. Their blast doors, massive slabs of metal and concrete that weigh as much as small ships, would seal shut. Only authorized individuals, pre-cleared and strategically selected, would gain entry. Government officials, key military commanders, specialized analysts, continuity personnel. Inside, they would continue running the affairs of a country whose surface lay in ruins. Outside, millions would fend for themselves in a land transformed by fire. The gap between those saved and those abandoned would become impossible to ignore, and the nation, fractured by trauma, geography, and survival, might never reunify. All of this was in the plan. All of this was expected. All of this had been rehearsed. And all of it was avoided only because the object that triggered the response evaporated from the sky before reality could follow its course. But the people who tracked it could not shake the feeling that nothing about that night had been random. They replayed it in their heads, each blip, each correction, each heartbeat between alerts. They remembered how the object behaved, not drifting, not tumbling, not chaotic, but intentional, steady, intelligent. Missiles fall apart when they fail. Satellites break when they lose power. Ballistic bodies don't vanish. Something else happened. Something that left no trace except unease. One senior officer later confessed to a colleague that he couldn't stop thinking about the heat signature, the way it decreased in the final second, not suddenly, but like a flame being pinched shut. He described it as deliberate, though he couldn't explain what he meant. Another remembered how the object's trajectory held perfectly until the moment it disappeared, as if guided by something more precise than any known systems. And then, there was the most troubling detail of all. The object did not drift off course. It did not fall into the ocean. It did not explode. It stopped. Like a decision had been made. Not by the United States. When the internal review ended, everyone returned to their routines, but none of them walked away feeling safer. If anything, the opposite was true, because the plan, the one rehearsed for decades, refined through Cold War dread and modern geopolitics, worked only when the threats were human, predictable, understandable, governed by physics and politics. But the thing that vanished over the Pacific that night didn't act human. And if it had been carrying a nuclear device, one analyst, late during the final debrief, finally said the words everyone had been avoiding. "We're prepared for a bomb. We're not prepared for something that can choose whether the bomb arrives." His supervisor didn't respond. There was nothing to say, because that single sentence exposed the real fear that no report would ever put on paper. Whatever happened that night was not the end of anything. It was the beginning, and the next time an object appears on that radar, there might not be a disappearing act to save the country from what comes next. In the months that followed, the incident settled into that strange limbo where national secrets go to rest, not erased, not acknowledged, simply absorbed into the machinery of silence. The technicians rotated to new shifts. The analysts moved on to new assignments. The files were sealed in climate-controlled vaults, where classified events wait for future historians who may never be allowed to read them. Life above ground continued, as if the night never happened. Freeways filled at rush hour, stadiums roared, airports hummed with the familiar complaint of jet engines. People planned vacations, opened businesses, argued about politics, and watched the same skies that had nearly delivered something unspeakable. But inside the agencies that had glimpsed the truth, something had changed. Not officially, not publicly, but psychologically. The trusted assumptions of decades now wobbled on uncertain legs. There had always been three pillars of strategic stability. 1, that threats are detectable. 2, that threats obey physics. 3, that threats come from familiar adversaries. That night cracked all three. Some dismissed the incident as an illusion of data, an echo, a misinterpretation, a 1 in a billion anomaly. Others quietly but persistently believed it had been a test. Not by a rival nation, but by something else. Something that understood the edges of American defense better than any foreign intelligence agency. Something precise enough to mimic a nuclear trajectory and powerful enough to disappear without trace. For these few, the implications were not just unsettling, they were existential. Because if the United States could not identify what moved in its airspace that night, then it could not protect itself from a threat like it. And if it was a test, then tests are never done once. They are done again and again, until the real event begins. A small team inside NORAD reanalyzed historical radar anomalies stretching back decades. Events dismissed as atmospheric noise, strange signatures over oceans and deserts, anomalous heat spikes, objects that appeared for seconds and vanished. The deeper they went, the more patterns emerged. Not clear enough to prove anything, but unmistakable once seen. The world had noticed things before, pilots seeing impossible lights, naval sensors detecting impossible speeds, but those were dismissed as curiosities, unidentified in name only. This incident was different. It wasn't a light, it wasn't an echo, it wasn't a blip. It was an object on a direct arc toward American soil. An object with intent, or something indistinguishable from intent. And then there was the final, most chilling pattern. Other countries had seen similar anomalies, quietly, secretly, near their nuclear sites. Across Europe, across Asia, even near the Arctic where rival submarines patrol beneath sheets of ancient ice. Whatever moved over the Pacific that night was not unique. It was part of a constellation of unexplained behaviors circling the world, like silent questions no one could answer. At an interagency meeting months later, one scientist from a national laboratory made an observation that was meant to be humorous, but landed like prophecy. If something out there wanted to study us, our nuclear weapons would be the first thing it watched. No one laughed. The room remained still. Not because they believed in aliens, not because they feared foreign adversaries, but because the simplest explanation, the most grounded, rational interpretation, was that some unknown intelligence, human or otherwise, had just demonstrated a capability the U.S. did not possess and could not counter. One senior official, nearing retirement, summarized the unease in a sentence that was never recorded, but echoed through the walls long after he left. "We can stop a missile. We can negotiate with a nation. But we cannot fight something that chooses when it exists." And that, more than the vanished object, more than the near catastrophe, more than the secrecy, is what terrified everyone the most. Because if the world is moving into an era where threats no longer behave like threats, where they arrive without origin, without warning, without explanation, then every plan, every doctrine, every bunker and protocol becomes an illusion. The night over the Pacific proved one thing beyond doubt. Humanity's greatest fear has never been the bomb itself. It's the moment when we realize the bomb is no longer the most powerful thing in the sky. By the time winter settled over the Rockies, the night of the vanished object had already become a kind of private mythology inside the agencies. Not officially. No memo or report dared elevate it to that level. But in the quiet murmur of conversations behind closed doors, the event had taken on a shape, a presence, a weight. It had begun to feel like something more than a blip in the sky. It had begun to feel like the first sentence of a story whose ending no one wanted to read. And yet, the world outside never changed. Morning routines stayed intact. The hum of daily life continued as predictable as tidewater. People scrolled through their phones, complained about politics, filled grocery carts, sat in traffic, watched the news, counted hours until the weekend. Nothing on the surface suggested that one ordinary night had nearly rewritten the future. That's always been humanity's defining illusion, the belief that danger announces itself before it arrives. Inside NORAD, however, something did change. Not in protocol. Those remained rigid, fossilized, the accumulated sediment of decades of Cold War paranoia, but in outlook. Confidence, once unquestioned, now existed with an unspoken asterisk, the assumption that every threat had a source, every object had an origin, every arc in the sky obeyed known physics, no longer felt like truth. It felt like hope. What troubled the analysts most wasn't what the object had done. It was what it hadn't done. It hadn't drifted. It hadn't fractured. It hadn't lost speed or tumbling momentum or heat until the very last moment, when the signature faded in a way nothing in nature, nothing mechanical, nothing rogue, nothing built by known hands would fade. It dimmed like a decision, like the final breath of a candle, like something withdrawing. One analyst later described the object's disappearance not as a loss of contact, but as a gesture. "It stopped being there," he murmured, long after the official debrief, as if it was never meant to finish the journey. If that was true, then the implications were far worse than a false alarm, because something that can enter restricted airspace with purpose, mimic the trajectory of a nuclear weapon, and then choose to cease existing is not a malfunction, nor a threat misread. It is a message. The only question was, from whom? Or from what? The epilogue of any event, especially one shrouded in secrecy, often becomes the part nobody wants to look at directly. Human beings prefer endings. They like clean lines, resolutions, the relief of closure. But the truth is rarely so kind. What happened that night offered no ending, only the illusion of one. The incident proved, more clearly than any test or briefing or exercise, that the world's stability is founded not on strength, but on assumption. The assumption that the sky is empty unless we fill it. The assumption that threats must follow the rules of the machines that launch them. The assumption that danger will always make sense, even if it terrifies us. That night shattered those illusions. If the object had been a missile, an actual warhead, hostile and real, then humanity would have faced the most devastating attack in its history. The flash would have rewritten the map of the West Coast. The shockwave would have shredded cities into dust. Millions would have died, not in war, but in an instant of blinding physics. Fallout would have ridden the winds for days, poisoning farmlands, rivers, lungs. And in the ruins, the survivors, confused, terrified, fractured, would have faced an even harder truth. Help was never coming. Not quickly. Possibly not at all. Plans exist. Yes. Bunkers exist. Continuity strategies. Emergency shelters. Protocols refined in the age of Kennedy. Sharpened in the shadow of the Cold War. Updated in classified recesses after every geopolitical tremor. But they were never meant to save everyone. They were meant to preserve a version of order. And order, in the face of nuclear fire, becomes an abstract luxury of the underground. The analysts knew this. They had seen the projections. They had read the simulations. They understood better than anyone that modern civilization, its power grids, its food chains, its communications, its medical networks was a fragile web strung across millions of assumptions about peace. Break one strand, and others tear. Break several, and the web collapses. A nuclear strike is not just destruction. It is unmaking. And that night, the world drifted within minutes of the unmaking. But the object vanished, and humanity's peril slipped back into silence. The subway trains kept running. The streetlights flickered on at dusk. The world exhaled without knowing it had been holding its breath. Yet, for the people who watched the sky that night, ignorance offered no comfort. They were left not with relief, but with a question. An unanswered, echoing question that haunted them far more than the thought of an actual attack. Because an attack, at least, would have had a cause, a motive, a target, a source. It would have been an event that fit inside the lines of understanding. The thing they saw did not. In the months that followed, one of the senior officers on duty developed a habit of driving to an overlook east of the mountain at night. He'd park his truck, turn off the headlights, and stare at the sky. His wife asked him once what he was looking for. He didn't have an answer. He wasn't looking for something as much as he was waiting for something. But he could never articulate what. He wasn't alone. Several others who'd been in the bunker that night reported strange shifts in perspective. A radar technician quit her job and moved to a quiet town near the ocean, unable to shake the feeling that her work no longer mattered, not against threats that could appear and disappear at will. A young analyst became consumed with historical anomalies, filing requests to review declassified radar incidents stretching back to the 1950s. A colonel retired early, telling a colleague, "I can handle missiles. I can't handle ghosts. Ghosts, yes." That was the word used more and more often, not as speculation, but as a coping mechanism. Because a ghost is easier to hold in the mind than something that defies every known rule. And still, the object lingered. In absence, in memory, in whispered conversations behind closed doors. Its path played over and over, in simulations, in minds, in late-night thoughts. The same arc, the same speed, the same impossible ending. Again and again the question returned. If something erased the object, what prevented it from erasing something else? And if it could erase a threat, could it also erase intention, territory, defense, time? For one brief moment, the world had brushed against an intelligence, or a force, or a technology that operated not beyond human capability, but outside human comprehension. It had demonstrated power without aggression, precision without violence, and presence without origin, which led some to an even darker possibility. What if the object wasn't the message? What if its disappearance was? One analyst, years later, and long after the files had been buried under newer secrets, described his private conclusion. "I don't think we were being threatened. I think we were being measured. Measured, evaluated, observed, tested, and then spared." The idea chilled him far more deeply than any scenario involving Russia, China, or rogue nations. Those threats were at least familiar, predictable, human. Whatever happened that night did not behave like any adversary we know. And so the epilogue of the story, the part no one officially wrote, became a quiet acknowledgement whispered among those who had been there. The world did not avoid destruction because of strength, or strategy, or preparation. It survived because something allowed it to, which means the choice was never ours. That is the true horror of the night the object vanished. Not the threat of nuclear fire, not the fragility of emergency plans, not the helplessness of millions who would never know how close they came to annihilation. It was the revelation that humanity, for all its power, is not necessarily the dominant force in its own sky, and that if something out there can choose when a threat reaches us, or whether it reaches us at all, then the next time an object appears on radar, the outcome might not be mercy. The final classified note in the unofficial internal summary, written anonymously, in the margin of a printed page, captured the fear better than any formal assessment could. The countdown stopped at 0 this time, but one day something may let it continue. A simple sentence, a quiet warning, the last line in a story without an ending. Because whatever appeared over the Pacific that night had not closed a chapter. It had opened one, and the next time the siren sounds in the darkness, the sky might not go blank. The object might not disappear. And humanity may finally discover what waited on the other side of that vanished arc, whether it was a warning, a test, or the first small tremor of a future we are not ready to face. For now, the world sleeps under the same sky, unaware of what moved above it once. But the ones who watched it come and go do not sleep so easily. They know the truth that cannot be spoken, the truth that keeps its own kind of vigil. The scariest part of nuclear war isn't the bomb. It's realizing the bomb is no longer the most powerful thing in the night.